By way of introduction for our event, if you'll indulge me, I'll start with a reading of a poem by Gerard Manley Hopkins. As kingfishers catch fire, dragonflies draw flame. As tumbled over rim in roundy wells stones ring, like each tucked string tells, each hung bell's bow swung finds tongue to fling out broad its name, each mortal thing does one thing and the same. It deals out that being indoors each one dwells. Selves goes itself, myself it speaks and spells, crying, what I do is me, for that I came. I say more. The just man justices, keeps grace, that keeps all his goings graces, acts in God's eye what in God's eye he is, Christ. For Christ plays in 10,000 places, lovely in limbs and lovely in eyes not his, to the Father through the feature of men's faces. Hopkins' poem here is rich, giving credit to the way that all creatures are themselves. They speak themselves, but the human creature is herself, and like a poet, says more and holds more, holding grace, which makes more of her actions graceful. She's beheld and changed into more herself by being beheld. And she then refers to the divine in whose image she was created. And beautiful for this referentiality beyond the self, seen and seeing, spoken and speaking. Hopkins captures here, I think, something of the distinction of being human by imagining the human as artist, as aesthetically transformed, and as an art object in being beheld. And here we catch a glimpse of how artistry is a paradigm for the human condition. So some of you in the audience are either practicing or aspiring artists, and some of you just want to know what to make of the meaningful pieces you find strewn throughout the world. Tonight we'll listen to artists talk about their particular experiences of art making, and to a theologian who sees the work of artists as reflecting acutely a basic feature of humanness. Trevor considers imagination through the doctrine of creation Christologically focused and eschatologically oriented. Our hope is that tonight's conversation between the artists and the theologian will be mutually informing, and that those of us whose project it is, and this is all of us, to make something of the world, will be built up in our sense how to do it faithfully. Dan and Chris will each spend a little time reflecting on their practice as art makers, and then we'll have a conversation between the three. Dan, if you will begin us. I surprised him. He didn't know who was going first.
This is a recent shot of my studio. So the way I'm going to be talking tonight is about the making of things, and it only seems right if you could see the place where those things get made. When it comes to talking about my work, I find that the older I get, a little more difficult it is. And it's not that I have any less conviction or urgency or passion about it. I think perhaps the necessity to get myself out of the way of it, and perhaps not to try to control it as much as I had in years past. So let me talk about the making of it. That may be an easier way, and in talking about the making of it, I could kind of work around perhaps the meaning of it. It's in there. I make things, messy things full of color, made from materials that feel and smell wonderful. It was my first introduction as a painter, as a very young painter, walking to my grandmother's studio and smelling turpentine, smelling oil paint, and seeing the glistening tabletop of wet oils. These materials are full of potential and full of limits. And I use these messy, wonderful materials to make something that may help me understand something that I didn't understand before I made it. I recently, in a studio visit, told a group of gathered students that in my practice, I'm trying to make a painting that I'd never seen before. But all I have in my mind's eye are all the other paintings that I've seen before. Now, there's the rub, right? But it's also an interesting tension to push up against. The French philosopher Jean-Luc Morin states, "In order to see, we have no need for painters." I become suspicious with introductions like that. "At least in order to see what already gives itself to be seen." I'm feeling better now. "One knows what one sees and what one must see without search, without surprise. If, therefore, we have recourse, at least sometimes, to the indirect, descriptive, and optional spectacle," I love that, the optional spectacle of a painting, this would thus only be in order to see something other than what is visible to us. The painter sees and so gives to be seen what without him would remain forever banished from the visible. The painting, at least the one that is authentic, and there too is the push, isn't it, imposes in front of every gaze an absolutely new phenomena, increasing by force the quantity of the visible. The painter, with each painting, adds yet another phenomena to the indefinite flow of the visible. Marvelous. When I think about my work, mine is a practice of curiosity. It is a reach of intention, of hope. I hope to make something like the stone in a river or the shell on the seashore that will cause you to pause and to wonder and to begin to ask questions. The way into the work is from one body, mine, into another body, the work into the viewer. My artist statement says, "What has become increasingly important to me is the relationship between the painting as a physical entity and a transcending metaphoric object. I want to make a painting that stresses itself as a material object, yet also engages the metaphor of picture making." Right? To deal with something that's limited to its materiality, something that expresses itself in its materiality, and yet at the same time is gesturing outside of itself. There is the subject of the hand, right? The mark, of the color, of the paint itself, but there's also the subject of the poetic image, the meaning that it's gesturing towards. I think in this relationship that I find a strong connections to the experience of being in body. I think of my paintings as obstructions. They're attempts to interfere with you, the viewer, to stop you, to cause you to pause, to, for one moment, dislocate you, arresting, hopefully, your attention. And there are also points of interface, of connection, where two people could stand next to each other and say, "What do you think all that muck means?" The English poet, the painter and poet David Jones states that art shows that form is utterly bound to matter, yet also that this or that matter does not exhaust the possibility of forms. That's, again, a beautiful statement. In a world of simulacra, where we're awash with images whose thin meanings are predetermined for desire, persuasion, and consumption, I want to make something that doesn't look like what one might expect. I want to make an object that has not had its meaning predetermined. In fact, it may be an object that bears more witness to the clumsy and at times desperate search for meaning. I attempt to arrest moments where circumstance, response, and consequence begin to create structure. I'm interested in places where meaning used to reside, where it resided in one form and is yet to take on its new form. I see that in this old liquor store signage, a kind of beautiful set of forms dangling off the face of architecture. Its previous meaning had been stripped away and worn away, and now the structure, the form is existing there waiting, right? Waiting for meaning, and yet it's not waiting, it's projecting meaning. I'm sitting at the stop sign in Fairfax, and I look over, and here are these kind of beautiful forms and colors gesturing at me, winking at me. Right? a gift, right, from the cosmos. I make paintings where forms and gestures stand with intention. They reach towards meaning making, but haven't arrived at the place that that meaning is fixed. I consider myself a hunter of forms. I want to materialize that hunting, that searching, to give that elusive thing that is always passing, right? Like the tape on the back of this old delivery truck, and that's what you're looking at. You're looking at the back door of a delivery truck, standing, or sitting at a stop sign, and this thing is in front of me, and it struck me as a kind of this beautiful thing. And wondering, while I'm pulling out my phone to take the picture, I realize that I'm interested in the residue of meaning, right? The site, in this case, the site where an old label or some kind of perhaps a warning of what's being carried was on the back of that truck. And that's what that rectangle, triangle, or diamond shape is inferring. Also, I'm drawn to the evidence of intentionality. The beautiful worn surfaces on this door caused by the door being used again and again for the thing it's designed for. It's bearing a testimony of presence. I want to create optimistic objects that are laden with residues of intention. Again, this kind of gesturing towards meaning making. I'm also interested in the place. In this case, the embodied space of a street sign, Shoemaker Avenue, and for those of you who commute the way I do, you may recognize this sign at Rosecrans, where meaning is being negotiated, right? You have a city sign, Shoemaker Avenue, detour ahead, and then you have another image maker, a sign maker, who has marked across it. And at that site, there is meaning being negotiated. It's that space of transition, a kind of threshold of meaning making that interests me. I'm sorry, I probably should be telling you the things that don't look like signage or trucks, those are my paintings. I know them so well, sometimes I forget to point that out. This is a painting of mine. And often at this threshold of this kind of negotiation of signs and images, the new meaning isn't apparent. And in fact, that's the kind of tension that I often delight in. And if I can cite Trevor, the poet, in my case the artist, jolts us, causing us to stand and stare at the point, to pause and look again and again rather than moving quickly on, content that we have seen all and understood all, right? The charge of the poet, the artist, is someone who, again, creates pause. In this case, Trevor is saying, jolts us awake. Incredible sign on the border of San Diego and Tijuana. The Cuban-Italian writer Calvino tells this wonderful story in his short stories called A Sign in Space, in which he describes a character who is the first organism of time to create a sign, and the profound significance of that. Right? It's never been done before. So to use a hand and to use a tool and to make a mark, and when the hand goes away and the tool goes away, the mark remains. The assertion of presence, a powerful thing for a human being to do. I love the sign that says, your actions and conversations are recorded. It says more than that, but that idea, your actions are recorded. That's mark making, that's meaning making, right? So in my paintings, we have kind of signs of intention, signs of forming meaning, signs of hoping for meaning, signs that perhaps trust a viewer who is a meaning maker to do with it what they will. Rowan Williams states that we occupy a universe where things matter intensely, There is a significance, and when he says matter, he's playing with that idea. They matter intensely. They're stuff, they're material, intensely material. There's a significance to the materialness of things, but it matters in ways that breach the boundaries and carry significance beyond what they tangibly are. This is something that I'm very aware of in my practice. The physicality of the paint, its ability to hold, color, process, evidence, and meaning making. And here is the place of the embodied practice, i.e. a painting. This is the objectness that I spoke of earlier. The painting claims its own materiality, and at the same time, it points away from itself. It is itself, and it gestures away. I was very excited a number of years ago when I read this statement by Chesterton, because he gave language to a thing that I was doing in my studio. A person's search for meaning resembles a sailor who awakens from a deep sleep and discovers treasure strewn about, relics from a civilization he could barely remember. One by one, he picks up the relics, gold coins, a compass, fine clothing, and tries to discern their meaning. Maybe that's what I'm making. These little relics crashed off, or some attempt to point at those things. I think of these paintings in part as things that signal an in-betweenness. What do I mean by that? Being, again, fixed in the limitations of who they are at that moment, but also moving towards something new or something else. This thing you're looking at, this painting, is a stagnant image. It's not going to shift, but it implies a shift. It implies perhaps that if you look away and look back, things would be different. They're joyfully occupying, I hope, joyfully occupying a space between what they are, what they have been, what they are, and what they're becoming. I say that again. They are joyfully occupying a space between what they have been, what they are, and what they're becoming. And perhaps I'll stop there. Thank you.
I'm going to read a few poems in a minute, and if you don't like the poems, I showed them to Dan. I said, he knows my work. I said, choose the poems. If you don't like them, you can blame him. Sure, I wrote them, but I was told to talk a little bit about what it means to make as a person who makes poems. I try to use the verb make for poetry, since poesis is to make, is making, derives from making. So it's a making process, I don't always perceive it as a writing process. However, I'm going to read this disclaimer from W.H. Auden, which goes like this. I am always interested in hearing what a poet has to say about the nature of poetry, though I do not take it too seriously. As objective statements, his definitions are never accurate, never complete, and always one-sided. Not one would stand up under rigorous analysis. So, what I say here, I'm not worried about what you think. But I will begin by reading a poem, and I printed out a whole host of poems by myself and by others, and a number of them are, I have ones by Robert Creeley and George Herbert and Marianne Moore and Emily Dickinson and Lorraine Niedecker and Philip Larkin and A.R. Ammons and some others, but I realized I wasn't going to be able to read them all. And there's poems that feel like touchstones to me that I look to sort of say that's something a poem can do. I would like to do something too. So I'm going to read this first poem and the only one that I brought of another author, by a guy named Robert Creeley, who died about 5 years ago, who's associated East Coast with the Black Mountain School, which is kind of like if there was an East Coast beat scene, if you guys know your Jack Kerouac and stuff, although it's probably a little bit more literarily respectable according to those people who make respectability a thing. And this poem's called Bresson's Movies. It's about the French filmmaker Robert Bresson, but my French clearly is terrible. So I'm just going to read it as Robert Bresson, so forgive me if you care. Robert Bresson is a filmmaker who made a lot of very austere and sort of intense movies, mostly in the 50s and 60s, but up through, I think, the early 80s. And I had never seen one of his movies before reading this poem and being touched by it. And that, for whatever that's worth. But I feel like this poem is kind of like a ars poetica, or a reason for, or my understanding of what poetry is, and what I understand art to be somewhat. So it's called Bresson's Movies. And I know I'm butchering his name, so if anyone who knows, forgive me. A movie of Robert Bresson's showed a yacht at evening on the Seine, all its lights on, watched by two young, seemingly poor people on a bridge adjacent, the classic boy and girl of the story, anyone one cares to tell. So years pass, of course, but I identified with the young, embittered Frenchman, knew his almost complacent anguish and the distance he felt from his girl. Yet another film of Bresson's has the aging Lancelot with his awkward armor standing in a woods of small trees, dazed, bleeding. Both he and his horse are trying to get back to the castle, itself of no great size. It moved me that life was, after all, like that. You stand in the woods. Oh, I'm sorry. Life was, after all, like that. You are in love. You stand in the woods with a horse bleeding. The story is true. And I'll let that poem rest because I don't want to explain all my feelings about it, but it feels like a kind of the kind of poem that makes me excited about poetry and want to try my hand in it. I also have a series of quotations I wrote down by so many people that's sort of ridiculous. Simone Weil, Les Murray, Dorothy Sayers, W.H. Auden again, Stanley Hauerwas. But I'm going to read this one from Stanley Hauerwas, which is from a recent, talk he gave called How to Write a Theological Sentence, which I recently read and I was sort of moved by. I think the attempt to reduce Christianity to the essentials results in expressions of the faith, a kind of writing that cannot help but underwrite the sentimentalities of our culture. Thus, the widespread presumption expressed in inelegant sentences such as, God is love, or I believe that Jesus is Lord, but that is my personal opinion. Such sentences could only be produced when the simple complexity of the narrative that makes us Christians has been left behind. What we need to say theologically is that the truth is in the details, and it is the details that produce sentences that matter. I say that because my mode, the thing I work in, is sentences. I do some forms of traditional forms, but not a lot. Sentences are the thing for me. Robert Frost says to make poems is to go a-sentencing, like you're going for a stroll through the woods or whatever. So for me, anyway. So that's what it is. And so for me, I look for sentences, or I try to make sentences that are interesting, and I use lineation, AKA line breaks, if you don't know what lineation is, to put pressure on sentences and hopefully unlock some of their energy or obscure it, as the case may be. And I don't always know what I'm doing. In fact, I usually don't. So I'm going to read a few poems that do this. This first poem, I'll talk a little bit about them. Usually I do not. My friend Aaron Bells, who's a poet, says that he doesn't talk between poems because he's afraid that's going to be more interesting than the poems themselves. And he doesn't want people to remember that. He wants them to remember the poems. I do worry about that a little bit. So I'm going to try to talk about these poems in a way that I normally wouldn't at a reading. But just to give you a sense of where I'm coming from as a person who makes poems, if that is useful to you, especially in light of the subsequent conversation we'll have. So this first poem, all the language is found in it. In the run-up to the 2012 election, I wrote a series of found poems based on speeches by the candidates or writing about the candidates from the 2012, 1912, and 1812 elections. And I rearranged the language to suit my interests. This is one poem. This is from a speech that Mitt Romney gave, and I did what I did with it. But partly, again, trying to hold up the integrity of a sentence or find sentences that I didn't know were in the speech upon hearing it or first reading it. It's called To Future Generations. The center will cease to be, crushing freedom, pursuing happiness. We will stop giving. We will contribute debt to the next America. Education, hard work, living within means will be defeated by parents, by millions. My heart, we made a nation of Americans. They thought themselves, not each other. We had a gift, each of us. We knew it. The world, days. Then I tried to find whatever was opposite, or how find the hidden tone. There was always a certain tone of the speeches, and I looked for what was maybe swimming against the current. Another thing that I do with poetry is I have like an image. I just see a thing. I saw this opening image. I saw it. It was actually more poetic than what I saw, and I blunted it a little bit because it was one of those stories that if you write fiction and you tell this story and you're like, but that's what really happened, what I really saw, people say, yeah, but no one will believe it. And you have to sort of make it believable. And this image was too precious, too cute, although it's about death and, and so I changed it. And the other thing that's important is that the last word is plural, but it sounds possessive, and that's ambiguity is on purpose, for whatever that's worth. So you can't see that in a poem. You can't hear that. Your ear can't hear it. But the last word is plural. So the original image, there's two wings described, and I saw this, and there's one wing described. It was two wings, and that'll make sense in a minute. And I say all this partly because one way I make poems is I see an image, and I'm like, okay, what follows? And this came from a lot of failure of writing until I finally started to what I like to use the phrase, I started to listen to the material. What's the material telling me to do next? And that's what happened here. It's called Here. The wing of the crow crushed on asphalt is lifted by the breeze. Black sail on a black sea. At the next road, a school bus passes, propelled like a block of hard butter upon a skillet. And while the sun in the sky is low, its heat remains banked in concrete. We walk on, our journey anticipated like the bus is, and as vital as the birds. This is another poem that does something similar. I'm going to pass that poem by. A third mode is where I try to work out an idea. And so for one Lent, I wrote a series of poems for each day of Lent. And it was on Ash Wednesday, so I wrote a poem. That's it, I got to write a poem called Ash Wednesday. T.S. Eliot has a famous poem by Ash Wednesday. I do not mean to compare myself to T.S. Eliot at all. But I did, and I teased out the idea of Ash Wednesday, and I just, again, listened to material and saw where it went. I don't know why this poem went the way it does. I really don't, and I really was a thing of what I'm trying to do is satisfy the needs of wherever the sentences take me that might be interesting to me. So this is called Ash Wednesday, written on Ash Wednesday about 4 years ago, or drafted. I changed it a bit afterwards. So begins the action implied by what is called faith. Do something. Don't just hold an idea in the mind like a framed epigraph. What steps there are have been suggested by others who have gone before. Give something out. Give something away, which is to say, extend and release, receive. Why keep merely a promise in the mind like an epitaph, unread but by those who, diminishing yearly, visit graves? They read what's chiseled there only to think, no, cremation is the way to go. A couple more here. This is a poem That is like the truck that Dan saw. He saw that thing. I pulled up behind a car on PCH, and it said on the license plate, WOMB-VWR. There was also a thing that said something like, sonographers do it with sound, or something like that. And so I'm like, okay, so this person, I know what their job is. Anyway, so that was the thing. So I had this image, and I had to do something with it, and so I made it, and this is what came out of it. It's called Sonogram. An SUV at PCH waits for the light to change. WOMB-VWR spelled on its plate. Womb viewer, room viewer, bomb thrower. The driver one assumes for a job casts waves through walls to unveil the kid bound in the swim. Quick thumps like a wind-up monkey on its drum. That the heart? Summoning what? We are coming, fish to Aquaman sang without words, carried in the sea, the sound waves finding there an instrument for their energy. By this, villains are thwarted. They don't think so, and so reflexively light the visco fuse, conducted in fluid like the image, a boy, screened beside you in your temporary gown. You villain, your end is even now at hand. It idles, waiting for the light. A visco fuse is the sort of fuse that you light and can go underwater, just in case you're wondering. All right, I'm going to read two more here. Again, this is about listening material. I know I'm on Biola's campus, but I was enlisted, along with other writers, to write something about whiskey. And so here are a series of stanzas about whiskey, 3-line stanzas. I didn't know what else to write. It doesn't even have a title, except the first line is the title. And this is an example of where things generate material. So again, I'm just giving you a window into how I think. I don't know where these things are going to go, but I do listen. And you'll hear sometimes words carried from one stanza to the next. And that's how it goes. So it really is a thing of trying to make sentences that make sense. There's one sentence in here that makes absolutely no sense, maybe two. But I like how they sound, and my job is to serve the needs of the sentence in the poem as poem. And so there's two sentences I think will not hold up to any sort of grammatical scrutiny. And the first thing, too, is usky and whiskey. Whiskey is spelled first without an E on the first time, and the second time with an E in the first stanza. And sight is both place and vision. That's important for the first stanza. Usky became whiskey in English, not whiskey, says the sight, just as G to the ear disappeared in sight. You've been drinking, she said to his face, no bottle in hand, but a word on the breath and two in the blush. The cops flag drivers down to halt invisible futures. Where are you headed? Stoppered by a mark inflected on air. A flask, a pod that splits its cap, releasing to soil what blooms in the vein after catalysis in ripe stomach. Stomach ripened from gullet, whiskey from mash, corn from the burn that left earth enriched by ash. Ice elongs delivery. Jameson comes in a bottle that's green while Bushmills is clear, concealing loyalties. Not in Belfast, though, not in Boston. The priest in the power and the glory, fugitive, embittered servant, embodied spirit and spirits, a secret to himself. Whiskey goes down with a kick, but leaves the skin sweetly. My uncle an exception, sweet in the mouth, kicking going out. Arrested for driving on the wrong side of the road, he later said to his counselor, I see what you mean to do, it won't work. After work, my dad made Mom a Manhattan on the rocks nightly. The news was on. Dinner, too, was on. I want to underweigh the past, but it's linked to the glass at hand somehow, like a scent. In Mumbai, the German and I lifted 2 tumblers of Nika, tongues burned, the sound of wind filled the street. I think I'm going to end there. Thanks, you guys.
Well, my first question sort of follows quickly. Thank you, folks, so much. You were talking about making your work. I wonder if you can start by talking aloud together about when is a piece finished? Is it finished with audience? Where does that play in? When is your work finished?
So there's a famous quotation by, I think, Paul Valéry, the French symbolist poet, who says, a poem is never finished, merely abandoned. So I don't know. When it doesn't suggest itself that it needs some major thing, or how about this, when I'm not uncomfortable when I read it. That's maybe the best thing.
And a listening to it, attending to it. It's funny that I should say listening to it, and I'm looking at the thing. And part of that is shown by a sense of discomfort. It exposes itself, but when it doesn't call for something more, and then to return to it again and again. Recently, I realized there were several paintings in my storage rack that when I was given opportunity to exhibit, I wouldn't pull them out when the curator or the gallery director would come to the studio. That was a pretty good indication that they weren't finished. I thought they, at some point I thought they were, so they went in a staging area, and then apparently they were not. When you bring in the audience, that's a whole different thing, because in that sense, then the work's never done, right?
So it's more finished for you as maker for a moment, and then it becomes, is it fair to say then it's unfinished again?
Yes. There's a release that happens, but then it really gets going.
Can I complicate the mix slightly? It seems to me that we have a painter and a poet, and there's more an illusion of finishedness about both a painting and a poem perhaps, than there is, for example, a piece of music composed, which has still to be performed. I mean, one might say that it's complete when the composers put the last dot on the manuscript, but actually, we all know that a work of music needs to be performed. The same is true of a play and any performative genre. But actually, the same is true. I mean, you just gestured towards that, Dan, that the same is true of a poem or a painting, because it's only when it means something to somebody that it becomes alive. And there's a process ongoing of meaning making, which doesn't stop with the artist or the poet. It continues. And therefore the question is, I suppose, is it ever really complete, or is it open-ended in its possibilities?
Yeah, I just that thing too, we were talking earlier about that thing with if you hope that the work has greater meaning and greater sort of agency than you yourself do as making it. We talked about that at dinner, and that is another thing too, is that you hope that the thing is, I'm sort of banking on my poems being smarter and more interesting than I am, and at least in terms of as verbal constructions, or as things that the voice, to use this music, to carry on with music, things that the voice plays, that as a voice reads it, they are then playing that poem and the ear is apprehending it, that hopefully it's got more going on than even I myself was aware of. And that can't happen if I feel like I've closed down or fixed the meaning securely.
And I think that's where both of us referred to working into the materials we work with some sense of unknowing and a gesturing towards meaning making. And I think that meaning making occurs when it then goes out, when it invites a kind of chorus of participants to engage it.
Can I ask the question that journalists have a horrible habit of asking now, and ask you how that feels? In other words, you hand something over, you've finished with it, and you put it out there. I mean, do you not feel a certain sort of proprietorial longing to hold on to it and control the meanings that can accrue to it? Or is there a sense of really having to let go and to be, self-sacrificing in a sense, that you've put everything you can into it, and now you have to let go, and it becomes of it what will become of it, with what people do with it.
I would like to kind of posture one way. Years ago in my practice, I decided to change from a representational practice to a non-representational practice, in part specifically for that reason, to kind of get my ego out of the way, my controlling ego. This thing means this thing. So to kind of offer up a certain vagueness or an open-endedness, right? Thinking that more abstract language would allow for that. And the reality is, every time it leaves, this thing is kind of, it's a part, it kind of came forward. Startled though at times when that genuinely happens, because I think I expect it less. And about a year ago at an exhibition, walk in at the end of the opening. I'd left the exhibition space, and at the end of the event, I walk in and there's a female standing in front of one of the paintings, and I could just see her from behind. She was the last one in the space, and the gallery director was going to close up the space, and knowing that I was going to walk up and thank her for coming and kind of cue her out the door, and when she turned around, she was weeping, which startled me, and then she smiled and said, "Thank you for making this painting." I had no idea, I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know how it spoke to her. It went way beyond my expectation, and that was quite startling. That I'm glad to give up.
Yeah. I mean, the reason I asked the question is because it seems to me this is one of the places where there is an interesting potential analogy between human creativity, what the artist does, and how we think of God's creativity. So bring the heavy theological boot in here for a moment. Because I think most often we tend to think of God's creativity as being a controlling one, yeah. that God sets things up, that God brings things to the way they're meant to be and hands it over to us. Whereas I think there's a very good case and actually an important case for saying, there's a sense in which God sets up the world, but he hands it over for us to make more of and to do something with. And that's a costly thing for any artist to do. And it's a costly thing for God to do, not least because the consequences of that, we're all aware of them. Yeah. But creativity engenders more creativity in other people. It doesn't shut creativity down. And I think there's a lot to be learned there from the experience of human artists, perhaps, in our understanding of what it is for God to be creator and the costs of that, as well as the obvious sense in which God does set things up the way he wants them, but then takes a risk.
Yeah. There's a story at the beginning of Kathleen Norris's memoir, The Cloister Walk, in which she finds herself at a residency, and she being the only writer amongst a group of philosophers and poets. And at the beginning of this memoir, she's kind of musing in her anxiety, and in that anxiety was, what authority do I have in the presence of scientists and philosophers? And of course, she meant was, in with the intellectual authority or the academic authority. And then to some delight, she realized, the authority she has is that which she's willing to give to the audience. She releases her intentionality for it to be picked up. And there I see a kind of gesture of, really a gesture of God.
Dan and Chris, you both have different ways of capturing this, but you both report a kind of unknowing that marks your art making. Has that always been a core experience of yours, or have you had to practice ignorance?
Comes to us naturally.
I practice ignorance. I practice it all the time.
I told them earlier I was going to say.
I don't even know I'm practicing it easily. So it's hard. So when I was in graduate school, if I have former students here, I'm sorry if you hear the same stories you've heard in class, but maybe they will take on new nuances and. Look, there's some way in the back. but one is, when I was in graduate school, when I started writing, I wanted, I really didn't want, I wanted to wrest control over it. Like, I had an agenda for everything, and if a thing was misread, because it would be misread, it's inevitable, I don't care how good it is, it's going to be read in a way that's not going to be to the artist's or even to a sensitive reader's liking by somebody. I would get frustrated and flustered, and I would be like, you don't get it. You just don't get it, man. Like, you're not reading close enough, you know? And it was really because it was terrible. It was terrible. But part of that terribleness was that I really was not interested in the thing itself. I wasn't a fan, necessarily. I was of poetry, but I was a fan of myself, which is still something that I'm working on. And I was a fan of my own... I don't know, my own lofty ideas, which were probably also very terrible and elementary, but I wanted to sort of get them across. And I remember being in graduate school and I was working on some stuff, and I don't know I'm not sure what happened. I think just repeated failure, like failure can be really good. Repeated failure after a full year or so, then I started to make some things, and a friend of mine said to me in the graduate school, who's still a friend of mine, a good guy, he said, "Hey, what happened? Like, did something wrong? Did some catastrophe or something happen in your life?" And I said, "No, why?" And he said, "Well, because you're making pretty good stuff." And it's very different in voice. It was very different voice. And so that was exciting. And it wasn't, I think it was, I mean, I guess unless catastrophe, week in, week out of failing is a kind of catastrophe, but I wasn't seeing it as such. I was seeing it as a failure of, if I just keep practicing, I'll be able to say this thing, I'll be able to control the language better. And instead, it was that thing I said when I read, I started listening to what I wrote. So I'd write a line and I'd listen to it. I'd write another line and I'd listen to it. And I still remember one of the two poems I made that came out of that I still sometimes keep in rotation. Like, it's always kind of on the edge. Like, it's a thing I go back to just to remind myself that that's the poem that Jeff, my friend Jeff Lytle, who was in grad school with me, asked, like, what happened? What is some breakthrough? And the only difference was a difference of composition, a difference of method, a difference of I didn't change what I believed or cared about, but I did change how I went about making, and I took myself out of it a little bit, and I said, here's some words. What do the words suggest next? Not how am I going to force this sort of inorganic flow onto the thing, and that was really great. And the thing is, as you said earlier, Trevor, afterwards you can have that conversation, like, is this really something I want to put out in the world? Did I say a thing that I want? Does it carry with it implications that I don't want? Whatever. But at the time, in the time of that thing of making, my main job is to make a thing with integrity as best I can, and that was the first time I felt like I ever did that. So that's a kind of practiced ignorance. It's akin to, you know, John Cage rolling the dice and saying, whatever it says, I'm going to do the next thing. But also he's bound by his own limitations. So I would say that was my example, and that came when I was in my late 20s.
And that what you're describing is a kind of intentional serving, but a serving of a different form, serving the material, serving the art that you're working with, as opposed to serving your intentions initially. Yeah. Chris and I share a very similar kind of youthful, impassioned earnestness that mine is a very similar story in which, as a young person of faith, I was a college convert, that just a burning sense of necessity to do what I was understanding at the time, that the teachings I was being given, that somehow the artwork had to operate a particular way, and that this God that I had kind of newly been introduced to couldn't operate outside that form, couldn't operate, within the tradition of the materials. And then also later realizing the significance and the importance of getting out of the way and honoring the form and allowing whatever kind of speaking that go on through that. It doesn't mean that we don't work with intention, and there's been different seasons of intentionality. And I had a number of years working on projects and collaborating with individuals with disabilities, with profound disabilities, and part of the obligation was to tell a story. And so it wasn't, in that sense, the materials I was using, the paint, the video had to serve that story. And then now, in a sense, that story is different in the practice. But
Can I ask a question? Both of those methods you've just described sound to me as if there's an interplay there between creativity and something that sounds and looks very like discovery. So it's almost as if you're stumbling across a lead and you haven't a clue where it's going, but you've grasped it and you're going to follow it through. You're following the suggestions, the connections as you go. I mean, is that a fair summation of it? Is it really that mixed up? Is it?
Yeah. Yeah, no, it is. And what I like that you said that was so that the poem I read about whiskey, the stanzas about whiskey, I had a thing. I was asked to submit some writing about whiskey, so I said okay, and then I needed a form for it. So I started to I'll do short little stanzas, and I had haiku on the mind recently or something. So I did short. Those were not haiku-like stanzas, but they're short little stanzas. And I started to work within that three-line stanzas. And I'm going to somehow see if each stanza suggests the next one. And in that, so I did have some intentionality, right? And then I ended, which I felt like, so when do we end it? Like I ended because the last image was one that suggests sort of communion and might have pointed towards the supernatural, right? Or there's a wind that blows in the street, right? And it's about across language. So there's a Pentecostal sort of image, which again, I don't know what it means. I don't know where it came from exactly, but I didn't see it coming, but I felt like submission to three-line stanzas about this subject. And those were my two rules I had to sort of stick to. And it led to this image that seemed to me kind of beneficent, that seemed like an okay place for a poem that also talks about darkness and being possessed by forces beyond yourself in a positive way. So,
yeah. And isn't it, there's a delight in that, a delight in being the first audience,
yeah.
You know, when it works. And it kind of that as a gesture of a way of being, to be present and open to surprise, to delight, to wonder.
And the Scottish novelist, poet, fairy tale writer George MacDonald, you're probably familiar with. I mean, a long time ago now, 150 years ago, wrote a series of short essays on the imagination. And one of the things he's reluctant actually to talk about human artists as either poets, because he points out poiesis tends to have a strong association of making, bringing something into being, and even less happy, therefore, with creator. Which really only comes into discourse about the arts after the Renaissance. You know, it was prior to that, it was only God could be talked of as creator. He's nervous about those, and he says, actually, you know, what we are as human artists, or poets in his case, he said, we're trouvères, we're finders. And it's as if God has created a world, and he's stocked into that world all sorts of possibilities and possible meanings. And the artists are those who look at the surface level and see something and burrow it out, and like a child almost finding something buried in the garden, and you know they take it out for others to see, and they lay it bare, and they're delighted with it, and everybody else gets delighted with it. But they're not creators; they're just true. Now that maybe understates the role of the creator, I think, or the artist, but it's a helpful redress, perhaps, to the very overblown idea of the artist as someone who calls into being something radically original and not there before he or she brings it into being.
We're just kind of pointing at the pennies. I mean, those of you in the audience who've read Annie Dillard's Tinker Pilgrim's Creek and the chapter on seeing, she starts with this story of, you know, as a child hiding pennies, and then with chalk, you know, making little arrows, a surprise this way, right? And then so of course, you know, we live in a landscape that a generous hand has strewn with chips of copper, and the necessity to develop a personal economy in which finding a penny will literally make your day. Like, that's a charge, right? To find God's graciousness. Particularly in a world, while you're repositioning, I'm trying to cover for you while you get untangled. Don't look at Melissa. You know, particularly I think in a world laden with duress, right? With the kind of pain that is inflicted upon the planet on a minute-by-minute basis, you know, to practice that kind of looking is a real. It's both a discipline and I think a real gesture of faith. Right?
I want to say, and that is important, I think, and that in your comment too about that, Trevor, because like I once likened poem making to being like a person who slides those tiles around, and those little games you get, and you try to make the little picture out of the tile sliding. Because the language, I didn't invent the language. I trust that it has meaning. I also do. I don't. Right, and so I don't know what the forms are that are going to come out of it. So I find that interesting, and I think about there's this class that we teach together, and we use part of Andy Goldsworthy's. What do you call that? Landscape art? Whatever he does when he makes stuff out of just what he finds in nature. And he has this one line where he says, each time it fails, the project fails, the stone teaches me more about itself. So he's already saying the stone itself has a kind of, he's already trusting that the stone itself, and I do feel like with language there is that. So I like that fine image, partly because I don't feel like a creator in that larger sense, because I don't feel like I'm the language. Someone else, other greater, wonderful people cultivated it and found configurations for it. But at the same time, and I think that's what the Stanley Hauerwas quotation at the beginning was that that kind of language that's already sort of there can get worn out, like contextually, within context. And I do think one thing is to say, like, okay, these are habits I have. How can I use those against themselves or against me, or how can I subvert my own thing and see what new meanings are there in my own habits of speech or habits of making, whatever those might be, and see what's latent that I myself don't find. Anyway.
So in this conversation, we're talking a lot about sort of the similar functions and practices of the visual and verbal arts. Can you guys talk for a little bit about where the verbal and visual do different things? And then I always hear how they inform each other. But can you talk about maybe how they do some different things?
Well, I was sitting in the front row, being kind of taken by Chris's poems, and at some moment a bit envious or jealous, thinking, on one hand, we are receiving the thing firsthand, and looking at my image, it was projected, which is not how it abides or exists. So on one level, the painting resides in a fixed place, and it either has to travel to you or people have to travel to the object. In a poem, it's sung or embodied in the performer, and in that it's residing originally each time. Would you say? As soon as I start talking about poetry with any kind of authority, I realize I know very, very little, if not anything, and I'm sitting next to a poet.
Yes. And that's the other thing, and that's also, painting is all at once, right? Or you choose where to go, and poetry is linear. A painting is audibly silent, but it's visually arresting, and a poem is visually, I guess, silent, you'd say, but it's audibly, it exploits audible possibilities of the ear and of the tongue and the mouth. So those are differences which are really just technical, and you stand before a painting, and then so its colors are activated in your eyes, and you hear a poem, and the sound is sort of activated in your ear. So they're just different physical processes.
They're both embodied, aren't they? Embodied.
They're both really embodied. That is important. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think also they, in both cases, it requires, or at least it requests, a certain kind of silence in the person receiving them, that invitation to arrest one's thoughts for a moment to take it in and to allow space for that poem to reside, or that space for the painting to abide. And in both cases, I feel like the forms offer up a space to occupy. Right? The meaning in some way is blocked. And one of the things that I was struck by poetry in relation to my painting years ago is that what gets left out in poems, leaving that ambiguous space for the listener to move into, it's an inefficient form of language, right? And I think good painting does the same thing, or a good visual object does the same thing. It leaves some form of a gap or a question.
One of the things that struck me, though, as I was listening to Chris's poetry, and indeed as I was looking at your paintings, was how quickly visual images came to mind when I was hearing your poems, and particularly because I had them in front of me and I could read them. So there is a pictorial element, and it immediately stimulates pictures in the mind, in the mind's eye. Similarly with your paintings, I think immediately what you find yourself doing is saying, okay, what's that about? So that words come into play very quickly, and there's an imaginative context within which we seek to make sense of things, try and situate them within a pattern where they make sense, so that actually it's almost as if pictures won't be separated from words for very long, and indeed words from pictures. And that probably ought not to surprise us when we inhabit a tradition in which the most important word of all doesn't remain word, but actually becomes flesh, right, and image, as if somehow visualization and being embodied, being physical, being material, in the way that words are just as surely as pictures. I mean, words are sounds, or they're marks on a page. That matters. We can't just have an abstract... Matter matters, yeah, exactly. Thank you. I could have said that myself. I probably did.
I think you did.
It's one of the shorter sentences in my book. So the two things do go together. Not necessarily complementarity, but tugging in different directions, but both seem to pull the other with them fairly quickly.
There's a line that Simone Weil says that, I don't know Weil or Veil, I don't know how to pronounce anybody's names, I'm sorry. But she has a line where she talks about this connection between embodiment and action and language, where she says something like, if I act in such a way that's self-serving. She's talking about people starving in Europe in the mid-century of last century. And she says, if I act in such a way that affirms my own separateness from them and my refusal to sort of be with them, as she understood that. She says, I thus corrupt language. And she says, and the point of language is to show the relationship between things. Yeah. So it's in one of her aphorisms that isn't totally worked out, but there's this feeling of she's making this connection between standing in line, waiting for food, ignoring those who are suffering, seeing that as a place where language gets corrupted, and when language gets corrupted, you stop to see the proper relationship between things, which is what language is for. And I think back of that, I mean, there's a couple poems I didn't read there that are more abstract, like philosophical, whatever. And the idea is that even in there, they're back, you know, Ezra Pound has this great line about why he doesn't like abstractions. And he says, if you ask anybody what the color red is, they say, well, it's a wave or a particle. And they said, well, what's a wave? And he says, well, then it's a vibration. And then what's a vibration? He says, well, then he says, it's a modality of being. And you get further and further from the things that he knows perfectly well, which is that thing on the wall over there, to so because soon you're over your head and over his head, right? And this idea that somehow you move away from that. And what that implies that even the most abstract language, back of it somewhere has some relationship that we can see, because that's where it came. You know, like watch your head when you walk out of the hut or whatever. So.
Well, there's also a possibility of kind of reinvigorating these things that are always with us, reinvigorating language, reinvigorating the visual, reconfiguring it in some ways that it stands up in a little higher relief for a moment.
think I have maybe one last question. We'll see. I'll ask you one, and I'll see if there's room for another. Trevor, in your work, you're making the significant point that the human being is essentially an imaginative being. How, and this is for all of you, but how does looking at the artist as emblematic, how does that help us understand our humanness?
I think there are several ways one might answer that. One is, it's not an unfamiliar move to make, but Dorothy L. Sayers is one who makes it, and that is to point to the fact that we're made in God's image, and the first thing we learn about God in the Bible is that God is a creator. God loves to make things. And the one way of understanding the image, therefore, is in terms of this creativity, this predisposition to make things, even when there seems to be no point in making them. No gain, no material gain. And very often for artists, there is not much material gain, it has to be said. They do it because they love to do it, and because it seems to need doing. But I think it's very important to not exalt artists in the way that sometimes Western society has, to put them on a pedestal as superhuman or, geniuses. Doubtless some of them actually are geniuses, but present company included, no doubt. But they're really engaged in something we all do as human beings, and that is, Tolkien in one of his poems uses the image of a prism through which the light of God's world shines and is refracted into a spread of colours, the whole spread of the spectrum. And his point is that actually, as I said earlier, God's creation isn't wrapped up, finished, and in its total glory until we engage with it, until we make something of it, make sense of it, respond to it. And that's part of the completing work of God's creativity. But we do it in all sorts of very mundane ways, just interpreting things, making sense of things, and it's part of a continuum, really, from the very simple things we do creatively in day-to-day life, right the way up to the most self-conscious and deliberate acts of making something which other people then have to make sense of. So I think it's the artist is actually an important figure, because I think they're a sort of concrete parable of what it means to be a human creature in God's world, made to be a creaturely creator, if I can use that phrase.
How do you follow that?
Yeah.
Try.
I wanted to kind of, I was going to dislocate it, but you made it sound so beautiful. I think I'll just abide in that for a while. But I want to bring the audience into it, because in some sense, we're merely kind of gathering some things together. The real work happens with the audience. So the opportunity to move into an imaginative state, which we kind of always are in the state of, but to volunteer to do that, to do the difficult work of being a reader, a watcher, a listener, a participant, because it's not a passive process in which you're involved in. It's an extremely active process, and I think, at least I was going to speak for Chris, he's right here with the microphone. My sense is, as we spoke to earlier, the work is hardly gotten begun until it gets taken up by others. And so it's participation.
Yeah, there's a thing about, and this is the, let us make man in our image, right? There's that plural, there's that, right? There's the plural, that pronoun to me is really important. That at the point of the initial creation, it's like, hey, let's do this thing either together, or do you see what I've done? Respond. I mean, that thing. And I feel like works of art, like any kind of communication. In fact, Robert Pinsky talks about this, about people who don't have language sometimes, or who don't have interpersonal capability. So certain schizophrenics or whatever will still talk maybe to themselves. The idea being that the voice, that any kind of communication presupposes an audience. And it is sort of a fundamental act of that kind of creative action, which is that kind of communicative gesture, whatever it is implies communion. And I want to say it's Dorothy Sayers, but I want to say it's her, but she says something like, no work of art, no matter how cynical or skeptical, can be anything but a work of hope at some level. And that somehow it's a hope that someone will hear this and understand, or whatever that might be. But I think that could absolutely, that just extends beyond that need or that belief in community. And we are talking about certain limitations that we can't escape that are kind of beautiful. And one of them is that genuine need. And that points, I don't mean some sort of apologetic thing, but that points to me to that sort of larger meaning beyond the self. The fact that there's a poem or whatever, I don't care what it is, any kind of statement suggesting some listener immediately takes me out of myself. And that's a hopeful thing, an incredibly hopeful thing. So anyway.
Can we open up for a few questions from the audience? Maybe 2 or 3, which means...
You gotta be quick.
2 or 3 questions from the audience, which means that they should be good, not quick. But if you get to ask...
Can we just like grade the questions?
No.
No pressure.
Yes,
All right, I see
I'm not going to answer that.
Ms. Delling. Stand and project. And ask a good question.
So I appreciate what you said about how the artist has to trust the audience and let go of what they've done in a way. But I'm curious about the workshop space that most of us are in as artists. Being in college, we've decided that instead of just striking out on our own and trying to get published or get a show, we want to be apprenticed pretty heavily. And that we will entrust our work to masters first, and that we're really in need of strong critique before we give it to an audience for them to bring their own interpretation to it. So, tell us how to trust you as teachers.
To trust us.
And how to neglect your advice when it's appropriate.
After you graduate.
I just graduated basically the whole world needs avant-garde thinkers in order for real art to get made, and I'm trying to figure out how you are a real artist in the sense that you don't follow other people, and you're also a real artist in the sense that you do. You're always at
Maybe I can, as the non-artist and the person who knows nothing about it, therefore, really, other than from the outside, just G.K. Chesterton has a nice line where he points out that the role of a good critic is to help the artist, but also to help other people to see that in the artist's work, which he or she may not have known they'd put there. Now, my guess is, in other words, no artist can know how much they've invested in a work, or the meanings which will accrue to a work when they let go of it and put it out in the public space. They certainly can't control them, but the point is they can't predict them either. And I think Chesterton's point is that, a good critic helping you to do that, an artist will actually probably recognize when that is being interpreted well. They'll say, yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I never saw it. And that's not how I would have described it at any point, but I think you're right. I think that is there. So there's still bad criticism, and judgments still have to be made about that. But in a sense, you have to trust other people to be able to see things that you yourself don't see in your own work. And just as you trust people to see in you things that you don't necessarily see in yourself, but other people may reflect them back to you. Because a certain sort of objectivity is actually a constructive thing.
There is, I think in both Chris and in my case, there is an assumption of a very rigorous critical discernment in the practice. And that is in part what we were talking about in terms of serving the material, serving the tradition, serving the history. And so, in one space in which one is creating, there is an audience of the tradition, there's the audience of the technical discipline, there's the audience of the hundreds of hours of practice. There then is also an audience of peers to draw in. And so while you're in university, it's set up, at least in the art department, we think about it in terms and set up a curriculum around developmental kind of stepping stones, emulation, imitation, emulation, innovation. So first you learn the history, you learn the tradition, you learn the technique, and then you begin to develop your own voice. And in those last stages of the undergraduate experience, a rigorous holding of accountable your own intentions. How are you intending to use this form? How are you intending to speak into what particular conversations, and what are those conversations? So, how do you position yourself to those? All those ways of showing how one might continue that. And then in there is that kind of performative moment of letting it go, right? That spoke to it at all.
I don't know how to answer it, really. I don't know how I could say you should trust me. You probably shouldn't. You can trust that I can say, which is true, I mean it, but you don't know that, but I'm going to try to listen and care about the things that you care about. My best thing was when I talk about a poem that a student brings forth or something is, what is the poem trying to do, and where is it doing it, and where is it not? So I echo, everything they said, I feel like that could have left it, that I could concur. That's one thing. The other thing is, too, you're going to meet people in your life, and I have people in my life still. I still show stuff to, where you say they care about the same kinds of things I do at that same sort of thing, and they feel trustworthy to me. And that's taken a long time, but I'm grateful for that. And sometimes people who you disagree with, or who you do not get your stuff, or you do not enjoy, can also teach you something. I remember another friend of mine in grad school, he had a workshop leader, and he said, I go to him, and everything he says, I do the opposite of. And then I know I'm on the right track. So sometimes there's that sort of thing as well, but I do think sometimes it's personality, sometimes it's a stage in your life. There are people who, at one stage in your life, you feel like you can track with, and another stage of your life, you're like, I don't know quite what I saw there. And I don't have a great answer beyond a fumbling answer.
From our neglected right,
Well, I could only find in the moment, from who I am, who is that accumulation of experience. So that accumulation of experiences sensitize me to perhaps those things that I'm going to discover, right?
Again, speaking as a non-artist, so take this with a pinch of salt. I've talked to a lot of artists and read some who will talk about the way in which the work actually refuses to go in certain directions easily. And it's as if you've discovered something which has already a form, even though you've not yet formed it. And in the forming of it, you experience resistance if you try and do certain things, and they just don't seem to work. It's as if the thing has a persona of its own. And it almost compels you to go one way rather than another. And you could force it, you could go the other way, but it would feel wrong. And so it's not so much holding creativity and discovery in apposition or pulling in different directions. It's almost as if actually the extent to which you acknowledge that objective constraint of whatever it is, the idea or the work or the form, is actually your creativity. It's like, Michelangelo talking about the statue waiting to be chiseled out of the block of stone. In a sense, it's already there. Of course, it's not, but there's a sense in which it is. Does that make any sense to you?
No, absolutely. All I know is that when I was trying to put too much of myself onto my poem in a really self-conscious way, I made really terrible poetry. That's the only thing. I'm not saying what you heard tonight was some sort of necessarily for all of you, the chambers of heaven opened when you heard it, but I am saying for myself, it was embarrassingly bad, but I didn't see it at the time. So that I'm speaking strictly for myself. So when I tried to exert too much on it, and I do. I mean, there's a poem that I had with me tonight that I was thinking of reading. That's 3 stanzas long, and the first 2 came quite easily. And I was trying to adhere to a very strict kind of line count and stuff, somewhat arbitrarily made. And the 3rd stanza I had, and I sort of came right off, and it was sort of awful. And it took about 2 or 3 years of coming back to it and then discovering, oh, this is what it's supposed to do. And what it's supposed to do, I had no clue. But the first 2 or 3 years, it was this, I kept rejiggering it, and it kept saying this sort of, it got really preachy. It just became a poem that told you what it meant, which is in a very kind of hectoring and just terrible way. And so finally it became a side of discovery later, and it was great because I thought I was done with it. I thought I was like, gosh, I really loved those first 16 lines. If only I could get it to 24 lines and make it do, I wish I could keep it, but I thought, it's a lost cause. And then at some point it just sort of said, no, here I am. And it was, it sounds so like touchy-feely and terrible. It was like sitting down and working with it, but it didn't feel, it wasn't my own exertion. It was just a thing that showed itself.
And in that description, I think, is a beautiful kind of example or testimony of serving something outside yourself, right? Kind of humbly serving the thing, whatever that thing is.
And by the way, I had some friends who read those earlier versions, and they said, this is great. This last part is not working at all. It's terrible. And so they confirmed my hunch. So I would just say that thing about having a workshop like that. I continue to have friends I show it to, and I had friends I trust who sort of said, this idea is the way it's moving as a piece. It's like a sculpture with a really deformed section that you need to cut that off and put something else there. And that was great. They didn't tell me what to put there, but they told me something was not happening.